Hello and welcome to Bit Armament's YouTube channel. This was a presentation I had to put together for a class I did, and I'm now sharing it with everybody else. This is going to be why I think the 12 gauge is superior for law enforcement use and home defense use over the 223, or how I learned to stop fearing and love the recoil. So, why do I like the 12 gauge over the 223? It starts really in the history. So what we're going to discuss is the internal ballistics, a little history of the 223, the external ballistics 223, the history of the 12 gauge, external ballistics of 12 gauge, Newton's third law of motion, and terminal ballistics. So the 223 really owes its history to the Germans in World War II. They made a small caliber round that they took their standard caliber round, shortened it up, and made what they called Kurtz rounds. And it gave them a little more aimability and lightened the load for the general soldier. Then we had the small caliber high velocity program and the intermediate rifle programs of the 50s immediately following the World War II. And the idea was smaller, lighter bullets so a soldier can carry more ammo for a set amount of weight. It also reduced the recoil. You basically get the same benefits that the Germans were seeing with the Kurtz rounds. Then Remington took their 222 cartridge, added a little bit to the neck, and called it a new cartridge. There was another bit of history with Pedersen and his rifle and his cartridge, but that's a whole different story. So external ballistics. Here's the specs from Orbital ATK, who is the current manufacturer for Department of Defense 223. If you take the 62 grain bullet, it produces, I think they're a little fast, 3,020 feet per second. My experience has been probably a little closer to 2,600 feet per second, but you're throwing out about 1,700 joules of energy. So 12 gauge. This is where it gets a little different. 12 gauge isn't so much the diameter as it is the size of the weight of the lead ball that goes through the bore. It comes from the age of the cannon when you pretty much measured your bore by the weight of the projectile. And in this case, they use gauge as a fraction of the bore. So in our case, 12 gauge is a 1/12 pound lead ball. So I picked SAMI, Sporting Arms and Ammunition Manufacturers Institute, since they are the people who set the standards for civilian firearms. Internal ballistics. Ballistics go as follows. You've got 9 pellets that are almost 33 thousandths of an inch. They're 54 grains apiece, and each one of them little joules is traveling between 11 and 1,300 feet per second. Gives each one 205 to 285 joules of energy. When you multiply that by each one of those, you're in the area of 1,800 to 2,500 joules total. With a slug, you've got just one solid mass. It's about 1 ounce. And they're traveling between 1,200 and 1,600 feet per second and producing between 1,800 and 3,700 joules of energy, which is a significant jump. So Newton's third law of motion. This is the one where I like to tell people this is how you can feel the difference. For every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction. When you pull the trigger on that 223, you get a small kiss in the shoulder. It's not that significant, and neither is the muzzle energy coming out the front, because that's the opposite reaction. When you pull the trigger on that 12 gauge slug, you feel it, and that's the energy that's also coming out the other side. So if you look at the recoil of a 223, if you've ever shot one, there's not much to it. The recoil of a 12 gauge there's a lot more recoil and a lot more energy involved in that projectile. So, I mean, which one would you want to stop a threat with? The kiss of a 223 or the kick of a 12 gauge? There's a little more reference for the energy. 223 is producing about 1700 joules per trigger pull. The double-aught buck is producing 1853 to 2570 joules per trigger pull. The slug is producing 1874 to 3700 joules of energy per trigger pull. So terminal ballistics is basically the study of what the bullet does once it's impacted a body, be it solid, semi-liquid, whatever you want, whatever you're trying to interact with. For stopping animals, you have three primary methodologies. The first is exsanguination, which is severe blood loss. The second is central nervous system disruption. And your third, it's not so much the end of the line for them, but a sensory overload of the central nervous system can also create a momentary shutdown of function. So with the terminal ballistics of the 223, you have roughly a 1/4 inch hole going in through a semi-fluid body. It would be a moderate-sized temporary wound cavity and exit somewhere around 44 thousandths, so just so that you have a frame of reference, a little smaller than a 1/2 inch. So we move on to double-aught buck. So you've got roughly 32 thousandths entry hole. You have multiple temporary wound cavities that are probably equivalent roughly to the 223. And the permanent wound channel would be roughly the same size as the pellet just because of the spherical nature. However, you do have the potential of having 9 of those. So you've got larger entry hole, roughly the same size temporary cavities, but you have 9 of them. Then we move up to the 12 gauge slug, which has roughly a 7/10 of an inch, just shy of 3/4 of an inch entry hole, and it's going to produce a pretty gnarly temporary cavity. And exit, it's probably not going to be too much smaller or too much bigger, providing how the slug is actually manufactured and if it maintains its shape and size. So the big old fat and slow slug, it don't care about your feelings and it still gets the jobs done. It might be 100-plus-year-old technology, but it's still extremely efficient. So I hope you enjoyed this. This was, again, a project I had to put together for a class I took. I don't think I spent the full 5 minutes I spent doing this in class, but I hope you enjoyed it. If you like this kind of video, please stay tuned and let me know so that I can try to produce more like it. Thank you.